Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. Those of you who are here in the sanctuary, as well as those of you who are joining us virtually. It's a pleasure to be here tonight for our program, A Time to Talk, Jewish Views on Death and Dying. And I'm joined tonight by our member and friend, Jacky Berger, and our friend, Eddie Dressler from Dressler's Jewish Funeral Home, both of whom will introduce themselves further when they get up to speak in just a few moments. And tell you what their background is and why they're here on the panel this evening. Our plan for tonight is for each of us to speak for a little while each, myself first, then Jacky, and finally Eddie. And then we will open it up to questions, comments, discussion at the end. As you're thinking about questions that come up, though, we are going to ask that the questions be sort of general in nature, and that if you have something that is very specific to your own situation, your own life, to talk to one of the three of us offline, as it were, privately, so that we can have a further in-depth conversation about what your particular question or issue might be. So we'll begin by talking about Jewish views on death and dying. And the question is, where does this idea come from? Why do we talk about this? In Deuteronomy chapter 30, which we read just a few weeks ago on Yom Kippur, we read the words, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life." The Torah tells us to choose life. It tells us to focus on our lives, to focus on the lives we are living, the mitzvot we're doing, the good deeds, the work of tikkun olam, the relationships we are building with other people. And yet, the Torah does put before us that before us is life and death. And that as we're choosing life, we can't but escape the idea of death, the finality of death, that death will come at some point to each one of us, and that the choice at some point becomes not our own. So ultimately, according to Rabbi Avner Weiss, there are 5 reasons why he presents in his book, Death and Bereavement, a Halachic Guide, of why it's important to talk about this issue of death now, and now being really any time that is the present. And his reasons are that death is inevitable and cannot simply be washed away. Sometimes it announces its coming in long illnesses. Sometimes it comes unannounced with shattering, unexpected suddenness. So it's important to talk about it ahead of time, because we don't know always what that time will be. He also says that the very worst time to deal with death is after it happens. When we are shattered by grief, when we are dealing with the suddenness of the reality of this new world we are in, finally having the conversations about death can be very difficult. And Eddie, I'm sure, can speak to that in his work at a funeral home, that those who are shocked by the grief have a much harder time in planning for the next steps. Rabbi Weiss also says the problems created by the death of a loved one are technical and emotional. There are a number of things that both Jacky and Eddie will speak about that are very technical, very logistical moments, very logistical steps that need to be taken, but that the emotion also weighs in on it. And by planning for the technical ahead of time, the emotional can be set aside for the moment, so that when the emotional part weighs down on us, we aren't totally weighed down and unable to approach the technical. Burial and preparations can become unnecessarily complicated as things progress after a death when it happens. And in Jewish tradition, as we will discuss, the idea of a funeral happening quickly is important. And so needing to bury someone, needing to prepare for the burial in a short time frame can become very complicated. And the emotional disorientation of the bereaved cannot be overemphasized. Until you've walked through the valley of the shadow, you don't know how you're going to react. And so by planning ahead, by talking about it ahead of time, we can help lessen that burden that we just can't foresee how it's going to affect each and every individual. In the book of Genesis, we read about the human body, that Adonai formed man and women from the dust of the earth, that God blew into our nostrils the breath of life, and we became a living being. The Torah understands that our being, our entity, Jewish tradition teaches that who we are is made up of a body and a soul, a vessel, if you were, and a spirit that lives within. And the text in our tradition speaks about that idea of the soul being within us and the soul leaving us at a certain point, and that moment being death. Rashi comments on this verse in Genesis by talking about breathing into the nostrils, that God made us of both, of the earthly and the heavenly matter, and that the body, when we die, returns to the earth from which it came, and the soul returns to its source, the Shemei Rabbah, the great and holy name of God. In the Talmud, in Brachot, we say that when one awakens, we recite, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorahi. My God, the soul you have placed within me is pure. You formed it in me, you breathed it in me, and you guard it while it is in me. That our lives and our souls, our bodies and our souls are intertwined, but that when the soul leaves us, it's as if God takes that soul back to God's loving embrace. As we approach death, Judaism has a number of different viewpoints, a number of different halachic rules, Jewish legal viewpoints on the different stages of death and mourning. The first one that we're going to discuss is called the goses. It is somebody who is in the imminent stages of death. And the tradition teaches that a person in his or her final moments of life is known as a goses, which means dying or moribund. The word is derived from the sound heard coming from the throat as the chest cavity narrows. And the Talmud teaches that the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God, stands at the head of any goses. This special status means that the dying individual should be treated as a living person in all respects and not as an object to be avoided. Everything possible, therefore, to save a person's life is pursued, even if it means transgressing Shabbat or Yom Tov, a Jewish holiday. And in the same vein, however, we do not take any action that would hasten a person's death. We read that if there is something going on outside of the patient's room, a woodcutter cutting wood, we don't tell him to stop if it would hasten death. But at the same vein, if that is all that is keeping the person alive, we don't tell him to continue either. When someone is a goses, we are taught by our tradition that the presence of loved ones brings necessary and important comfort to the goses, as well as meeting the emotional needs of those who love him or her. These final demonstrations of love and concern provide all involved the assurance that they did all they could up to the very end. It also allows one to deal with grief directly and without the sense of guilt of not having done enough for the one who died. If at all possible, our tradition teaches the one who is dying should not be left alone. Yet we should try and limit conversations to those that meet the needs of the dying person. One should leave the room to eat, drink, or discuss extraneous matters with another visitor, as these may distress the one who is about to pass from this world. And psalms and prayers may be recited to ease the loved one's passing with words of our tradition, specifically those that speak of God's help for us, of God watching over us, and the 23rd Psalm, which speaks of walking through the valley of the shadow of death and God guarding over us. The dying person often and traditionally recites a vidui, the confessional prayer similar to that which is said on Yom Kippur. If the dying person is unable to recite the confessional, a person in attendance may recite the vidui on that person's behalf. The reason for this is that we want to make sure that our soul is pure, that we are forgiven for any sins known or unknown at the time of death. In the Talmud, in Tractate Shabbat, we read a section that says, we learn in a Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer says, repent one day before your death. His students asked him, but does a person know the day on which he will die? And he said to them, all the more so should one repent today, lest they die tomorrow. And then one will repent his entire life and spend his life in a state of repentance. The Torah tells us, the Mishnah and the Talmud tell us that it is important for us to be clear of sin, to find these moments of forgiveness in our lives, and if possible, for us to end our lives either saying or hearing the words of Shema Yisrael. After someone does pass, Judaism recognizes those who are considered the mourners. Now, we in the Reform movement have expanded this list greatly, but traditionally, the relatives for whom we mourn and who we are commanded to say Kaddish for are father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, and spouse. These 7 relatives, 7 categories of relatives. And our stages of mourning take different steps in them as well. Traditionally, we have 5 steps of mourning in the Jewish tradition. The first we call aninut, which is the period immediately following the passing of a near one and preceding the funeral, where no work is to be done, not supposed to adorn yourself with makeup, with leather, with jewelry, and it's supposed to be a time of deep, deep mourning, as evidenced by the feelings that one undoubtedly feels in those first moments. Following the funeral, the first week is known as Shiva or Shiva, coming from the word 7 because of the traditional 7 days of the Shiva. It commences immediately after the burial, after internment, and the tradition for Shiva is to be in the home, to sit on low stools, to cover the mirrors, not put on makeup, not shave, and to truly enter into that state of mourning. Coming out of Shiva, we have Shloshim, which is the next 23 days up until the 30th day following the funeral. Through this period, formal mourning is concluded for all relatives other than parents. Then we have what's called Yud Bet Chodesh, the 12-month period of formal mourning. Traditionally, one says Kaddish for a loved one for 11 months after the death of a loved one, specifically their parents. And yet the time period is called the 12 months. And so the question is, why do we only say Kaddish for the 11 and not the 12? The tradition says that only those who were truly wicked, only those who need a full 12 months of Kaddish being said for them to be redeemed, have to have it said for 12 months. And so none of us want to even give the idea that our parents may be in that category of 12 months. And so the tradition has become to say Kaddish for 11 months. And then finally, the last stage of mourning is the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, marked by the saying of Kaddish, often coming to services on the Shabbat nearest to the date, and the lighting of a yahrzeit candle. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, we read that you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not gash yourselves or shave the front of your heads because of the dead. And in chapter 21, it says, you must not let his corpse remain on the stake overnight, but must bury him the same day. For an impaled body is an affront to God. You shall not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. And these are the 2 verses that we have in our Torah that lead us into the idea of what the Jewish funeral service should be. I'm getting a lot of text. I'm just making sure it's not about our sound or anything. Jewish funeral service begins with the idea of tearing something. In ancient societies, it was customary to literally tear the flesh when one was in mourning to symbolize the physical pain that mirrored the internal pain that the mourner was feeling. But the Torah forbids us from doing so. And so the tradition has become to tear a garment of clothing. I'm sure many of you have seen it, either done in person or done in the movies. There's a great scene in The Jazz Singer with Neil Diamond, where the very Jewish Sir Laurence Olivier tears his garment upon seeing his son as dead. But we don't do that typically anymore, especially in the Reformed community. And so for this process of kriya, of the tearing, we often have the black ribbons that Eddie can get you before the funeral. And that is torn for those who are in mourning, typically the 7 relatives, although if you are related, if you are a close friend, we often expand the circle of grief the circle of Kriya beyond the 7. And the tradition is to wear the Kriya ribbon for 7 days or for 30 days. And there are different customs that people take on themselves, but during the time of Shiva or Shloshim, to have that visible sense and that visible sign that you're in mourning, to wear the ribbon. During the funeral service, we begin by the recitation of Psalms, usually the 23rd among others. Then we move to El Male Rachamim, the memorial prayer. And finally, there is a hesped, a eulogy that is given by loved ones, by the rabbi, remembering the person who has passed. And then at the burial, traditionally, the version of Kaddish that is said is called Kaddish Da'adata. It's the burial Kaddish. However, what has become the practice, especially in the Reform movement, is to say the Mourners Kaddish, the one that we know from the end of our services on Shabbat and holidays. Moving on to other ideas about different end-of-life issues that Judaism speaks about. First of all, speaking about suicide for a moment, Judaism has always considered suicide a major sin. We read that in the Talmud, we read it in the Shulchan Aruch, and even its contemplation is considered wrong. However, the rabbis have, in both traditional and contemporary responses in rabbinic writings, really worked to understand suicide as not necessarily the person doing it, but it may be an illness, specifically a mental illness, or that would lead to something like suicide, and therefore wouldn't necessarily be considered as major of a sin anymore. Furthermore, euthanasia is considered the same thing, that it's not consistent with our tradition, and that's been roundly written about by all the different streams of Judaism. Now, our tradition has felt that a dying person, the goses, should not be kept from dying, after all hope for recovery has passed. And the Sefer HaChasidim stated that and I mentioned, the steady rhythm of someone chopping wood is the only thing keeping someone alive, we should stop chopping the wood. Some rabbinic statements limit the definition of a goses to persons who will not live for more than 3 days. However, modern medical technology has made these limitations obsolete. Earlier biblical statements clearly indicated no positive acts to abbreviate life, even when there was no hope. In a later age, Solomon Agar indicated that medicine should also not be used to hinder a soul's departure, meaning that when all hope is gone, it's time to say goodbye, to withdraw certain forms of care. We then may say that at this critical juncture of life, when no hope exists, the soul should be allowed to drift away as peacefully as possible. We've become even more sensitive to issues of euthanasia following the events of the Holocaust and the experiments that were done, as well as the murder of so many of our people. Love of life in all its forms is very much part of our tradition, even when conditions of life are rather doubtful and when there might be serious questions about the quality of life. We cannot encourage euthanasia, nor we can make assumptions about the quality of life. That being said, there are a number of Jewish teachings that say that when a person is considered clinically dead, medically dead, and a study was done and articles were published that through Harvard and through other medical schools and medical institutions that lay out what the classifications of clinically dead are. And at that point, Judaism, throughout the denominations, will consider someone as dead for the purposes of removing treatment and removing care. So finally, I want to finish with just a few comments about what happens after death. Judaism has long taught that there is life after death, but the details, even within our tradition that has so many very strong and clear viewpoints, are often unclear and have been long debated. When the Torah was written, Jews believe that on death, all people descended to a dark place called Sheol. And we read this word often in the Psalms and in other places in the Torah. And Sheol is not defined, but it just says that we go there, or that we go to be with our fathers, that we are gathered to our kin, to our family, which is both a metaphor, but also something in biblical Hebrew that makes sense in a very logical way, because we found archaeologically many family vaults, many family burial sites where fathers and sons and even grandsons and their spouses and their families were buried together. As Jews came in contact with other influences, further teachings have developed. These included teachings on Gan Eden and Gehenna of paradise, the Garden of Eden, and Gehenna, a Jewish version of hell, not the same as we read about, say, in Dante, but a place where punishment happens, a place where the soul is kept away from the divine throne room. Sheol then becomes a place of purification or waiting, similar to purgatory, but a little bit different, before the individual was then sent on to Gan Eden or destroyed completely in Gehenna. It was around the time of the Pharisees and the early rabbis that teachings about life after death were developed further. The early rabbis taught that those who lived according to the halakha would be rewarded in the olam haba, the world to come. Later teachings about life after death include the idea that judgment would happen after the coming of Mashiach, of the Messiah. At this point, some taught that the soul and body would be reunited in a process of resurrection, while others believed that it would be the soul that is eternal. And with this idea of resurrection, and we see this in our liturgy where it says Mechaye HaMeitim, who gives life to the dead, the idea is that we will arise and make our way to the land of Israel. It's why in many traditional Jewish cemeteries, Jews are buried with their feet pointing towards Israel, or pointing within Israel towards Jerusalem, and within Jerusalem to the temple itself. Judaism teaches that ultimately, though, what happens after we leave this world is not as important as what we do in this world, that good deeds should be done for their own sake. As it says in the Mishnah, do not be like servants who serve the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward. Therefore, the work we do, the acts we do, the mitzvot we do, should be the reward in and of themselves, rather than our expectation that we will be rewarded in the hereafter. Thank you. Jacky? They're over on the table.
Thank you, Rabbi. I certainly learned some things I didn't know. Okay, welcome, everybody. I'm going to take my mask off. Yep. Still the person you saw 16 months ago, or however many months ago it was. Okay, my name is Jacky Berger, as most of you know by now. I'm a practicing attorney. I've been practicing for 38 years, more years than I'd like to admit, both in Florida and in Georgia. I do primarily estate planning and post-death estate administration. And basically, I've been doing this pretty much my entire career, along with everything else I've had to do in order to make myself into a well-rounded general attorney. But now this is pretty much what I practice. Most people think of estate planning as planning for after their death. However, I'm here to tell you that that's really not true. Estate planning begins pretty much the day that you're born. Estate planning begins with your parents deciding, oh my God, I have a small creature living in the house. And what happens to me? What happens to them if something happens to me? So your parents are going to plan for what's going to happen to you if you're a small child and God forbid your parents get into an accident and can no longer take care of you. Estate planning goes on throughout the years. A lot of times parents think about their teenagers and God forbid something happens with their teenager and they need to set up a guardianship because they have had some sort of settlement on a lawsuit and the settlement goes to a teenager and then the teenager can't handle the money. They're not of the age of the majority, so they have to get a guardianship set up. That's estate planning too. But mostly what concerns all of us is estate planning for us as adults. The first thing that happens when you're an adult is that you start having responsibilities. Some of those responsibilities are paying bills, car payment, house payment, apartment payments, all kinds of different things that you have to do in life. And we all have to be concerned on a daily basis about what happens, how are those things going to continue if, God forbid, something happens where we can't take care of those things. Now, most of us go along with our lives, and we have gone along with our lives, and nothing major has happened that has prevented us from taking care of our daily things, okay? If somebody's in a hospital, hopefully it's something that's very short-lived, so they come back and they pay their bills. A lot of us do things on automatic payment. Things get done in perpetuity. But what if you can't do that? Well, I have a perfect example of that happened to my family this summer, and with my brother's permission, I'm going to talk about that for a second because it's a very good case in point. My brother, who's 69 years old, was doubly vaccinated, a podiatrist all of his life, super in control of everything, head of the Florida Podiatry Medical Association. He'd be very happy I put that in as a plug. President of his temple, well upstanding in his community, always in control of everything in his life. Managed to get to 69 years old with not having one major illness. He was never in the hospital except for a cardiac catheterization, and that was just basically a same-day procedure. Wonderful health. Retires on July 23rd, closes his business, comes up here, closes on a house with his lovely wife, and his two sons living in Alpharetta, moves a mile away from his much loved sister, and he's here for 2 days. COVID, pneumonia, ventilator 25 days, in the hospital for 8 weeks, in rehab for almost a month. He's on a ventilator. His wife has never paid any of the bills in the household. His wife has never handled any of the major things in the house. She doesn't really drive very much because she lived in South Florida where the roads are flat. She can't handle basically anything on her own. But the good news is my brother had a power of attorney from 2004 in their possession in the vault. He did set up a vault when he moved up here. They knew where the power of attorney was. And therefore, my sister-in-law, who never took care of anything, now could take care of absolutely everything. She can handle the bank accounts. She can handle paying the bills. She did have my nephew do most of that. I handled most of the business transactions because she didn't know how to do that. But she had the authority to sign on the dotted line. So there was absolutely no lapse in anything in their lives. Okay? Without that document, time would have stood still. No bills would have been paid, no car payments. She would have been absolutely, as they say, and please forgive my vernacular, SOL. Should out of luck. Okay? So the bottom line is the durable power of attorney, which is the first document that I referenced in the materials, is really important. It's a document that gives the authority to an agent. You would be the principal when you create it. It gives an agent the authority to act for most things on your behalf. Now, What's important to know about the durable power of attorney is in most cases, it becomes effective immediately. It's not based on a disability. You can make one that's based on a disability that's known as a springing power of attorney. But most people don't have a springing power of attorney because in order to get a springing power of attorney to come into effect, it would be based on a condition that you have to elaborate in the power of attorney, like a long-term illness that exceeds a certain amount of days. Then what happens? You've got to get a doctor to write a note saying that you're too sick to handle things. You have to actually track that doctor down, get them to write you a letter, have it witnessed and notarized because no bank is going to accept it. And this all takes time. What I submit to you is that when things get bad, things have to be done immediately. There's no time to wait. So having a durable power of attorney that becomes effectively is the better way of doing things. Okay? Generally, a durable power of attorney is effective when signed, and it acts, as I put in your notes, as a blank check. The person that you give the authority to, whether it be your spouse or a child or a brother or sister or a friend, has a blank check. They are able to act as if they are you. Now, I'm kind of grinning when I'm saying this because most of us trust our spouses implicitly. At least I hope so, because many people have been married for a long time. You really should trust your spouse implicitly. I'm making a leap of faith there. But when you're giving the power of attorney to your wonderful children who want nothing but the best for you, you need to be sure of a couple of things. Number one, they're not going to treat mi dinero as su dinero, meaning they're not going to treat your money as their money. In my practice in Florida, had the occasion of having a client who came to me, whose brother lived in New York, was his very, very, very well-to-do stockbroker in New York. And he was the money man. So the parent gave the power of attorney to the kid and this particular child, and he had Giants season tickets. If any of you are football fans and you know anything about the Giants or the Redskins, the only way that you can get these tickets and retain them is by legacy. So if you have New York Giant or Washington, well, they don't call them the Redskins anymore. I'm sorry, I'm politically incorrect. The Washington team season tickets, you better hang on to them at all costs, but not at the cost of taking your mom's money and rendering her broke enough in her checking account that her Florida Power and Light bill was not paid and her electricity was turned off. So I had a client who called me whose brother actually took the mother's money as durable power of attorney and actually did go and use it as their money. So you have to make sure that the person you're giving the power of attorney to is not going to liquidate the estate. Okay, it's a scary thought, and it just happens to be that people can get in trouble. Okay, it's excellent for the purposes of an unexpected event like a hospitalization, an accident, or an unexpected trip out of town. It ends at death. The durable power of attorney is not a document that you want to use to perpetuate things after your death, because the minute that clock strikes 2, if that's your date of death and time of death, that document is rendered useless. Okay, examples of items that can be transacted by an agent are banking, mortgages, real estate, personal property transfers, stock transfers, and credit card transactions. Well, I actually once had to send a copy of Larry's power of attorney to Delta Airlines because I wanted to use his frequent flyer miles when he was living in Panama after we got married. That was also an efficient use of the power of attorney. Do you want to have 2 children or 2 people acting as your agent at one time? The answer is no. It makes it very difficult, especially if your children don't agree on things, to have multiple agents. You might want to have one person and then a succession of a next person and then a succession of a third person if you need to, if you have 3 children or 4 children. Name as many as you can in succession, okay? But you can also put in there that each of the children, although they're not your agent for the purposes of signing documents at that time, has oversight ability so that they can come in and they have a right to request an accounting from the agent so that the agent can make sure, you can make sure that the agent isn't doing things like buying football tickets and things like that. Another reason for having a single person as opposed to multiple is that banks will not accept a multiple agent unless you put in the document itself that each individual agent has the authority to act alone. Well, why is that? Because in the age of computerization, anybody could be sitting behind a computer doing a transaction. You're not going to have two people. Plus the fact the banks these days don't check signatures. I don't know if anybody ever realized that, but the bank is not checking your signature on a check. Okay, unless you tell the bank that there's a problem, they're not really looking. They're going zip, zip, zip. You could sign a Donald Duck and the bank would accept your check. Okay, so you really don't want to have multiple agents. You want to have one person who can come in, somebody who's trustworthy, somebody who's local, who can basically can get your stuff done. Okay, now I'm going to later on, before I conclude, give you some tips on how you can make this easier for them. I promise I'll get back to that. It's at the end of the materials. Okay, next document that you want to have done while you're alive and well and can do it is a more complicated one. This one is your Advanced Healthcare Directive. The Advanced Healthcare Directive, a big point about that is it only comes into play if you yourself are not able to communicate your medical wishes. If you're lying in the bed and you're sick as a dog, but you can still communicate and be not under a disability that would render you emotionally unable to make your own decisions, you can still make your own medical decisions. They're not taking away your decision-making abilities until such point that you're disabled. Okay, so whereas the durable power of attorney can become effective immediately, no disability, Advanced Care Directive becomes effective only upon a disability where you can't make your own healthcare decisions. A Georgia Healthcare Advanced Directive gives an individual the right to select a medical surrogate for them or an agent to make decisions on their behalf if they can't. First thing is, who should you appoint as your healthcare surrogate? Well, I always tell the story about when Larry and I got married and we had our little dog Puff. And Puff never walked up the stairs before. There were no stairs in Florida. We moved to a house in Maryland. The dog went up and down the stairs, pulled a muscle in his hip, brought him to the emergency vet. Larry came home and said, you know, Jackie, Puff's really in pain. I said, and? Well, you know, if this keeps happening, I just looked at him. I said, you are so off my medical directive. You're not on my living will. You're not making medical decisions for me. I said, were you inferring that we should put the dog to sleep because he was in pain? Because he, you know, no, that's not what I meant. I said, good, we'll end the conversation now. We never have to do this again. And I said, because I fear that if I stub my toe and I'm in pain, you're going to put me out for good. So, well, of course, that was at the beginning of our marriage. 25 years later, I think maybe I'll appoint a friend. No, I'm only kidding. He has earned my trust. But at any rate, you will have to appoint somebody who basically knows how you think and how you feel about things, okay? Somebody who has the requisite knowledge base to know whether or not you would want certain things done to you or whether or not you wouldn't want certain things done with you. We would hope that in the event that you have a spouse, that they would be that person. But it's not always the case because a lot of times spouses have very different viewpoints on things. And I've had occasions throughout the years where people have had a brother or sister who was in the medical profession or somebody who's a friend who's in the medical profession where they have bypassed a spouse. It's a very personal decision, but it is something that can make a spouse really angry unless you explain why. So communication is a very important thing. There are certain things in a healthcare surrogacy in Georgia that have a lot of different legal and Jewish ramifications. The first one really is about an autopsy. You, in an Advanced Healthcare Directive, it covers whether or not, in the event the law does not provide that an autopsy is required, whether or not you would like to authorize an autopsy if your surrogate or your personal representative executor asks for one. And your choice is, yes, I will authorize an autopsy, or no, I will not authorize an autopsy unless it's legally required. The Jewish religion basically has the following theories on this. In the event that an autopsy is legally required, Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative Judaism believe that that is something that should be done because of what they call pekuach hanefesh, which is watching over the soul. It's basically a principle that preservation of human life takes precedence and overrules every other rule of Jewish law. So if you have a family member or a loved one who has, and this has happened to somebody that I know within my legal or personal circle, where they basically got up in the morning and they walked to the other side of the bed because they did not see their husband, and their husband's lying on the floor, God forbid, 100 times, but it happened, dead. Okay. He died sometime in the middle of the night. They called the ambulance. The question is, why did he die? Did he have a heart attack? Did he have an aneurysm? Well, one part of the family said, he's dead. We don't really have to know why he died. He's dead. Other part of the family said, yes, but this has implications. If he had something wrong with him that's going to go down through the generations, we want to know why he died. Well, the end of the story was that he did not have an autopsy, and he did not have a healthcare surrogate that said which way it should go. But basically, that's something that you really do need to think about, that if it would benefit your family, or it would benefit your family to know, or whatever, whether you would want that to happen. Now, according to Jewish law, and I'm going to kind of wrap the next item and this item together for a minute, organ donation and autopsies have certain of the same Jewish principles that overrule them, or I should say rule them. One of them is the whole principle of having a sacred nature of the body. Jewish law prohibits the desecration of a body. So basically, an autopsy, taking apart a body, would generally, if you think about it strictly, be something that was not okay. However, if you look at it from the pekuach nefesh point of view, it's not desecrating the body because it's benefiting the human life and it's benefiting the soul. So therefore, you have to kind of balance what you think and what the definition is, okay? If it's going to save a life, if it's going to help, pekuach nefesh says, do it, okay? Jewish custom requires that the doctors treat the body with respect, complete the autopsy as soon as possible, that they limit the autopsy to those areas of the body where the autopsy is necessary. Reform Judaism considers that any advance to medical science to be pekuach nefesh. Therefore, Reform Judaism would allow an autopsy if there's any purpose for it whatsoever. Okay? Organ donation, same principle. Pekuach nefesh. If it's for the greater good of the soul, for the greater good of the human body, the Jewish religion allows for it. Now, about 9 years ago, my sister Shelley became a liver donee. She had a liver transplant. And at that point, I delved into the whole idea of becoming an organ donor, because growing up in a conservative background, I always thought, I can't be an organ donor. I have to be buried in a Jewish cemetery with all my parts. I'm not allowed to be missing parts. And it would be a desecration of my body if they took me apart for organ donation. So I did some reading. And what I found out is that I was wrong. I marked the date on my calendar because it never happens. I'm never wrong. And I put a star there. And I admitted it to a couple of loved ones who say, oh my God, Jackie's never wrong. And they're probably watching now, so that's a lie. But at any rate, it turns out that I found out I was wrong. And as a matter of fact, the whole concept of pekuach nefesh, for the purposes of saving a life, all three, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and I guess the Reconstructionists, I'll add a fourth, believe that for the purposes of saving a life, you can do organ donation. As a matter of fact, it's a great mitzvah to do an organ donation if you are saving somebody's life. The Reform movement and some conservatives believe that organ donation is for the purposes of medical science, also goes under pikuach nefesh because it is the greater good and you are saving somebody's life in the long run, although it may not be direct, okay, by doing that. Interestingly enough, in Israel, they have a very interesting don't give, don't get type of a law when it comes to organ donation. You are given preference in Israel for getting an organ if you're on an organ, if you need an organ recipient list. If you have a relative in first degree, which they consider mother, father, sister, brother, child, etc., that has given an organ donation, if they were a dead donor, I should say, deceased donor. If you were a living donee, because you can donate a kidney or part of a liver while you are alive, you have preference. And then the third preference is if you're registered as an organ donor and there are two people on the list, A and B, who have the same deficiency, their scores for getting an organ, because there is a scoring system, are exactly the same. The person whose name is on the organ donation list actually has preference. So not only was I proven that religiously I was wrong, I turned to Israel to see how they practice it, and they actually have that in statutory law. So that's pretty interesting to me. Okay. You also give directions regarding burial and cremation. Okay. Orthodox Judaism still, as far as I know, forbids cremation. Okay. Cremains are not allowed to be buried in Orthodox Jewish cemeteries. Notable exceptions were made for Jews that were involuntarily cremated during the Holocaust and are involuntarily cremated at any time. They're allowed to have Jewish burials in Jewish cemeteries. Orthodox Jews believe that the body is merely on loan from God, as the rabbi said, the creator, and therefore the cremation is a violation of law that keeps your body sacred. Conservative views are mostly to forbid cremation, but in 1986, there was a ruling that a rabbi could officiate at a pre-cremation ceremony if he advises against cremation and the family does it anyway, or if the rabbi could officiate if it's done without knowing what's going to happen, or if they weren't consulted. Reform movement does not prohibit cremation, or will object to a rabbi presiding over a funeral when there's cremation taking place, and most cemeteries now will allow for burial of cremains in Jewish cemeteries. Okay. I want to go to the burial and cremation issue. I'm going to skip it a little bit when we do the will part, but let me go to that issue now so that I can discuss making burial arrangements and wishes for burial. In your advanced healthcare directive, there is a place where you are given a choice for burial or cremation. Some people use that vehicle for expressing what their desires are, specifically if they have specific wishes for where they're going to be buried, how they're going to be buried, if they're going to be cremated, where their ashes are going to go, so that people don't fight. One of the things I can say over my 38 years of practice is there are very few things that I feel more strongly about than having conversations with people and planning for this particular event to happen. We all know that at some point we are going to be facing a situation where we are going to be passing away. It is not my job as an estate planning attorney to tell people they absolutely positively have to do pre-plans or they have to make, arrangements. I tell them that I like to put something in there that gives direction so that there isn't a lot of controversy. I've seen families fight, lose relationships over whether or not mom is going to be buried in New York where her husband is buried, or whether mom is going to be buried in Florida where her kids are and her kids can go visit her. Because mom has never said a word. I've seen situations where mom bought a prepaid funeral plan in Florida while paying her dues to a synagogue up in New York so that she could be assured a burial place. next to her husband and never told her kid that she rescinded the contract in Florida. So upon the death, everybody has this contract in front of them and they're like going to the funeral home, getting ready to make arrangements. And oh, this contract was canceled. Mom is going to be buried in New York now, and we're going to fly her from Florida up to New York. In a state where everybody now has pretty much moved here, I'm going to say the older generation, I am making a generalization from what I see. Most people have moved here from someplace else where they lived a good part of their life to be near their kids. Most people have not been born here that are my clients. And what ends up happening is they may have made arrangements someplace else or have family in other places, and they never have the conversation, even with each other, let alone with their kids, to say, this is what I would like to do. And as the rabbi had said before, the time, and Eddie will attest to it, the time to have that conversation is not when they're staring at somebody who has just passed away and they have to make a phone call to have that body picked up. And then they're going to have the conversation about what do we do. That's really not the time to have those conversations. So I would urge people, have that conversation, think about it, let people know what your wishes are, whether you formalize it in a will, whether you formalize it in your advanced healthcare directive, whether you put it on a piece of paper, do it. My wishes, I always said to Larry, I don't care where you bury me, just not in pantyhose. I said my definition of eternal hell would be to be buried in a dress with pantyhose. That's my wish. I wanted an aisle. I didn't get an aisle. All right, we made our plans, but I was able to, when I pre-planned my stuff with the help of Eddie Dressler, I actually was able to pick out what I want to be buried in and how I want to be buried. So it was my choice, not somebody else's choice, who really at that time may be under such anguish, because I know everybody's going to be grieving when I'm gone, that basically they can't make a decision. So at that particular point, it's really good to make your own decisions and to plan. Okay, on to something else. Let's go on to the next part, which is giving living will choices within your advanced healthcare directive. It is much better for you, even though it's not something, none of these things we really want to think about, but it's amazing how much solace we have when we think about it and get it resolved and put it to the side. None of us want to think of what happens if I, God forbid, am hooked up to machines and there's no hope for me. I'm unconscious, I'm in an unconscious condition, there's no hope of me recovering. The doctors are saying I'm not recovering. And this conversation is being held with our next of kin or a surrogate. And they're saying, okay, well, what do we do? Do we discontinue life? Do we make them live as long as possible, hook them up to machines? Or do we do choice C, which is the a la carte, pick and choose? Okay, A is I want to extend my life for as long as possible. B is the traditional living will, which basically says I don't want extreme measures. And C is, we can do X, Y, and Z, nutrition and hydration. We can do fluids. We can do assistance to breathe. We can do CPR. We can do the crash paddles. Basically, it's up to you to decide in advance what it is that you would like them to do to extend your life or preserve your life, or not at all. Okay? Living will also gives preference to who would be a guardian, if a guardian needs to be appointed for you. And it's in case of younger women who are childbearing years, it tells you, gives a choice of whether or not you would like your life to be saved or a viable fetus's life to be saved. There is a difference, however, between a living will provision like this, a DNR, which is do not resuscitate, which is given when somebody is in their last stages, and also assisted suicide declarations. We do not allow for assisted suicide declarations in Florida. I did have a question from somebody from the congregation who's not here at one point about which jurisdictions allow you to be hooked up to, a Kevorkian type of drip to be assisted in suicide. So I did add that in about death with dignity, states that allow you to assist in suicide. The Jewish perspective, generally Judaism does not allow for physician-assisted suicide. And with regard to certain churches regarding the rest of the living will, the rabbi's discussion went over those in a case-by-case specific basis. You should basically, if there's a doubt as to what Judaism would allow in certain situations, have a conversation with the rabbi or a rabbi. Excuse me, talking fast always and talking a lot does that. Okay, next area, wills. Okay, this is what most people think of as far as estate planning is concerned. How important is it to have a will? Well, in most situations, it's pretty important to have a will because it does express who's going to be able to take care of your affairs when you're gone. It also expresses in certain situations who your property is going to go to, but not in all situations. Well, I have clients who do a will and they have 2 children. Everything's being split evenly. It's a beautiful situation, except for one thing. Well, mom forgot to tell dad that on her IRA from work, she named her older daughter as the beneficiary. There's a couple $100,000 in that IRA. So the will doesn't apply to the IRA with a named beneficiary. Oops. Both the kids are going to be, one kid's going to be really happy. The other one's going to be really pissed. Okay? Wills do not apply to what we call will substitutes. And I put that in your materials. What are will substitutes? Will substitutes are property that you own in joint tenancy. You decide to open a bank account with your name on it and your kid's name on it. Why? Because if I get sick, I want my kid to be able to write a check. I want them to be able to take care of things. Really bad idea. Really, really, really bad idea. Okay, let me tell you why. Number one, you've now messed up the equalization of your estate if you have 2 kids. If you only have 1 kid, not so much a problem. Oh, my son is an anesthesiologist in New York. He makes tons of money. I trust him implicitly. So what's wrong with putting him on my checking account? Oh, he's an anesthesiologist. What's his malpractice insurance limit? It's $1 million. Great. You know that little boy he screwed up on last week? His parents are coming after your money. Whether it be your checking account, your savings account, your name on a piece of property that's not your homestead. Guess what? Your money, your property is his money. So therefore, joint tenancy with your kids, joint tenancy with anybody that you don't know well enough. Oh, they're a big man in the business world. Did you notice that they filed bankruptcy last year? And they can come after your accounts because their name is on your accounts. Yeah, you don't want your kids, you don't want your brothers and sisters, you don't want your friends on your bank accounts, on your property, because they can be taken as their property if the conditions are correct. Okay. Now, granted, in many cases, these things don't happen, but they can happen. And I'm not about to say to a person who's in front of me, okay, it can't happen. It can happen. And you just want to make sure that it doesn't. Okay, a trust, which I'll get into later, can be a will substitute payable upon death on a bank account. You have a checking account, you have a savings account, you want to give them some money to your niece or nephew, you got $10,000 in a CD, you say payable upon death. That doesn't go under your will, that goes to a named beneficiary. Those are payable upon death in trust for accounts, etc. Okay, life estate deeds. You have your house with your name for your life, the remainder is to your kids, so they get it upon your death. Great vehicle for avoiding probate, great vehicle for not having to put things in your will. Terrific. Again, a will substitute. So therefore, if you're giving your house on a life estate deed, it's not part of your will. Your 2 kids that I just gave an example to, if you're giving it to one kid, another kid's going to be pissed. Okay, it reinforces your funeral directions, which again, I went over, definitely plan, plan, plan. Okay, it appoints an executor or a personal representative. It appoints a guardian for minors. That of course does not apply to almost everybody in this room except for Rabbi Jordan. But you do need to think about who's going to take care of your minor children in the event that there's some sort of catastrophe. It sets up trust funds. You may have a child who's what they call a spendthrift, somebody who will go through money like nothing. You might want to set up a trust in your will that regulates who's going to be giving those funds and when they can get it, et cetera. Okay, and it protects non-traditional beneficiaries, nieces, nephews, partners, friends, et cetera, et cetera. About 25 years ago, when I was living in Washington, I was working for a trust company. At that particular point, the LGBTQA plus community was really not a community. They didn't even have the initials put together at that particular point. Okay, and our trust company was one of the first trust companies to actually market that community and say, do wills, do trusts, protect your partners, because legally they had no status. Of course, now with the allowing of gay marriages, there is a lot more of a traditional aspect to it, but if you still have partners, friends, loved ones who are not your traditional beneficiaries, a will provides that you're going to take care of them in the percentages that you want to, providing that you have not already divvied up your money otherwise. Things to remember: wills are only effective upon death. Well, I have a will that I made in 1990, and I only have nieces and nephews, and this week somebody's pissed me off, so I'm going to change my will. Fine, I'm an attorney. I can change my will every single day if I want to. I type it out. On the computer, you have the ability to change it. But in 1983, when I first started practice, I can mention the woman's name because she's dead and it's been that many years. Good old Minetta Kulikoff used to come into my office. I had a secretary who, the minute she saw her walk in the door, would cringe. We had legal paper. We had typewriters, no computers. Wills cannot be corrected. If you make a correction on a will page, you got to retype the whole thing, okay? She would come in every week and change her will. It got to a point where she would say to me, how much is it going to cost? $25, okay? I would charge her $25 because that's how much it would cost me in time with my secretary, with her benefits and everything else, to retype this woman's will. Well, she changed her will 35 times that I can count, okay? You can change your will until you die. So the will is only as good as the day that it's being read after you die. So if you think, oh, well, I have it written in my will that this has to happen and you don't want it to happen, change it, okay? Don't forget about pets and charities. Shameless plug for CDT, okay? We've been good to you, be good to us, okay? I recently spoke with a bunch of people who are dealing in estate planning, and they're seeing more and more people who are providing for charities in their will because their kids are of a generation where they have more money than God, and basically they don't need the parents' money. So they're giving money, whether it be large amounts or small amounts, to charities. I think that I've been asking a lot of clients recently who were telling me about their mega successful children, about their charitable inclinations, and have they been charitable throughout their lifetime? Would they like to include a charity in their will? Okay, and that's something to think about. Don't forget about pets, because if you have a pet that you love, you don't want people, the wrong people, getting the pet, okay? Because you might have somebody who's a bully in the family who says, I want mom's or dad's dog, and they may be a bully to the dog. You don't want that to happen. You love your animals, dog, cat, gerbil, etc. Okay, again, wills can be changed anytime until you die or you're incompetent. They are subject to probate if there are assets that are not covered by will substitutes. Probate in Georgia is not a scary thing, okay? You don't even need an attorney. I hate to say that. It makes me choke when I say it. You don't even need an attorney for a probate in Georgia. You just go to the courthouse or online, you get the forms packet, you fill it out, and you bring the papers to the court. It's a really simple thing. Okay, if you die without a will, however, the state will determine who your beneficiaries are. It's by statute. There's a statutory formula saying who gets precedence to your property. And something that you should know, in Georgia, spouses do not get everything if there are children. Okay, that's number one. And number two, if somebody makes a will and they disinherit their spouse, there's no protection for a spouse in Florida. I mean, in Georgia, excuse me, wrong state. In Florida, there is protection. It's 1/3 of the estate goes to the spouse. In Georgia, no protection. You can disinherit a spouse like that just by omitting them in the will. Okay. All right. Will substitutes can ruin or enhance your intent. If you have a will, as I just went over, anything in a will substitute doesn't go into your will. So therefore, if you're intending on things being equal, check your will substitutes. And if there's a will and a will substitute, your will substitute, like a joint tenancy, a named beneficiary, that will take precedence over your will. Okay. And the last thing I said, in Georgia, does not protect a spouse. Okay. Trusts for a minute. A trust is a great vehicle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on trusts. You can set trusts up two ways. One while you're living and one to be effective when you're dead. And you put that in your will. That's known as a testamentary trust. The first type of trust is an inter vivos trust. You can set it up while you're alive. You make yourself the person who makes the trust. You make yourself the beneficiary, you and your spouse, if you're married, just you otherwise, or you and somebody else. And then you make yourself in control of the trust. You set somebody else in there in case you can't manage things. It's like a durable power of attorney, but it's a different vehicle for it, where you can set somebody to step in the event you're unable to do that. Usually that requires a doctor's letter saying, you know, Jennifer Jones can no longer handle her own matters. Let the next person who's a trustee step in. Okay, it allows for them to manage the affair of the trust. There's continuity. The great thing about a trust that you make when you're alive and you start administering when you're alive is that when you die, everything in the trust just keeps going. You're just not the one who manages it anymore. Somebody else manages it. So there is continuity. It avoids the need for guardianship, which along with a durable power avoids the need for the court being involved in appointing a guardian for somebody that's not competent. But it is more costly to establish initially than a will is. And then you have a testamentary trust that's put in a will. That's commonly done for a child or an incompetent, somebody who is not able to manage money, somebody who you want to make sure that they're getting X number of dollars of money at a certain time. The one thing I would caution you about that is don't ever make a brother or sister a trustee for another brother or sister, or somebody a trustee for a niece or nephew if they're an adult, and there could be conflicts and you think that it might ruin a relationship, because nothing ruins more relationships than somebody saying no when somebody wants money. Okay, so if you have a brother and sister where a sister is a trustee for the brother, and the brother says, I would like a discretionary $10,000 because I screwed up and want to get another car. And the sister says, no, mom's intent was that you keep your car until it dies, and I'm not giving you that $10,000 down payment. You have now ruined a brother-sister relationship that could otherwise be very good. I would then at that point say, somebody who doesn't have any skin in the game, a bank, a trustee, a third party, an accountant, a lawyer, make them the trustee. Okay, miscellaneous tidbits. This portion, although I call it miscellaneous tidbits, don't be fooled. What I'm about to tell you is something very important, okay? In today's day and age where people are doing a lot more electronically, you really need to let someone know where the bodies are hidden. And what I mean by that is not actual bodies. If you have an email address and you do banking, or you do your stocks, or you do any accounts, credit cards, any of those things, and you have passwords for different things that have to do with financial matters and practical everyday matters, put the passwords someplace and tell somebody where the passwords are, and remember to update the passwords. Now, when I started practicing back in 1983, if Mineta Kulikov died, there were 3 banks in town. I'd go into the 3 banks. I'd say, Mineta Kulikov died. Here are her social security number. Here's her social security number. Did she have any accounts? And they'd say to me, yes or no. Or they'd play hardball and say, well, wait till you get the statement in the mail. Well, people aren't getting statements in the mail anymore. People aren't getting their quarterly stock statements in the mail anymore. Things are coming online. So it's very possible that your next of kin, your loved one, your child, your mother, your father, your brother, their spouse has no idea where anything is, okay? They don't know the passwords. Before my brother got hooked up to the ventilator, and I asked his permission so I can tell you this, before he got hooked up to the ventilator, he called his son and he said, get a pen and piece of paper. I'm about to tell you all my passwords. And at that point, minutes before he got hooked up to the ventilator, he's dictating his passwords to his son. There may not be time for that. In an instant, anything can change. So go online. Fidelity is one of the companies. You don't have to have an account with them. They have an account tracker where you can put all your account information, all your passwords in. You can get that information. If anybody needs it, email me. I'll give you the link to it. Okay. There's Keeper Security. There are all kinds of things that you can find online where you can use one master password and put in all of your passwords to be saved. They're encrypted. Nobody will ever see them except somebody you give him permission to. Okay. Get a password book, as stupid as it sounds. Put it someplace in your office or in your home dresser or in your night table, and leave a note someplace conspicuous, or let your son, daughter, spouse, etc. know. If anything happens to me, here are where the passwords are. Treat it like you would treat the safety deposit box keys. Okay. And by the way, if you have a safety deposit box and you're getting older, put a 3rd name on it. So this way somebody else can get in there if you both die. Okay. Little tidbit there. But the point of the matter is electronic communications, very important to deal with passwords to make sure that somebody has access to your accounts at any time, because there can be assets that nobody would ever know you have, because all you're doing is getting computer statements and they're not coming through the mail. Okay. Old school. Okay. Ethical wills. I'm going to just spend 1 minute on this. An ethical will is not a legal document. It's a document that basically tells your next generation advisory information on how you would like their lives to be ruled by the way that you lived your life. Okay. Basically, you would tell them what traditions you would want passed down to your kids that were important to you, what practices in your home for holidays, perhaps, you would like to have be maintained. It's a way for you to be remembered and also to pass along important things to your kids. Okay, it's advisory in nature, and there are great writings about it. Okay, ending this up, just going to say the old adage, which I was brought up with, okay, especially being a girl, I took it as a little bit of flattery too, was don't worry your pretty little head about it. I've had that said to me many times, including, but not limited to, by adversarial attorneys when I was handling family law cases in Florida. And nothing got me more angry than that condescending statement. But that was the old adage. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. If you're a spouse who doesn't know how the bills are being paid in the house, if you're a spouse that doesn't know what your gas company is, if you're a spouse or a person who has no idea of what's really going on in your house, worry about it. Make sure you sit down and have that heart-to-heart conversation. And the old song, don't worry, be happy. No, don't worry means that basically you're not going to be happy, because in the long run, you need to worry and you need to plan. And that's basically what I've got to say about end of life issues. And I hope that that was helpful. And if you have any questions, you can ask me or email. Okay. But we'll wait till after Eddie Dressler speaks. Thank you.
I have nothing more to add. Thank you. When people ask me what I do, I just say I'm in real estate. But I'm small lots. So I'm Eddie Dressler. I'm born and raised here in Atlanta. Went to Hebrew Academy, public high school, went to school in Philadelphia, and then went to work for a relative of my dad who was in the funeral business in New York. And that's how I got involved doing this. And so I came back to Atlanta in 1993 and went to work for a funeral home here, worked for them for 4 years, and then left and didn't have the money. So I made a deal with another funeral home and piggybacked with them for 4 years. And then we bought a little building and started our place, and we've come a long way. So oh, by the way, I have a family, wife, and 2 beautiful children. My baby's 21 years old. My other baby's 19 years old, doing very well. So I'll just give you an overview of what the funeral home does and a few other things. So when somebody passes away, we are contacted and we are responsible to transport the deceased from the location of death and bring them to our location. We are there to, be a good communicator between us and the family and the clergy to coordinate the details of the funeral and, hold the hand of the family, make sure that things go in a smooth manner. And of course, as you probably know, typically Jewish funerals are happening very quickly, and we're good at pushing things along at the pace that the family is requesting. We arrange for, certain customs that are either required by rabbi or requested by the family, like arranging for somebody to sit with the deceased, called a shomer or watcher. And, the custom of having a watcher is, of course, a choice, but it comes from, I think, a couple of different things. One is the need prior to modern times to protect the body of the deceased prior to burial, probably from animals, but also there's this belief that when somebody passes away, as the rabbi says, the soul is there and waiting and concerned that the deceased is buried. And so as a manner of soothing the soul, we arrange for and have somebody stay and read from a book of Tehillim, Psalms, as part of the process. And so we make the arrangement. Sometimes family members want to send individuals from the family or friends to come and sit, but we do are involved with making that part happen. And as you probably know, we arrange for and how the deceased is prepared for burial. And so if you're connected to a traditional rabbi or synagogue, then the deceased is prepared by volunteers in the Jewish community called Chevra Kadisha. And so in Atlanta, most of the synagogues have their own groups. And so if you're connected to that synagogue, we're calling that Chevra Kadisha. And these volunteers come and prepare the deceased for burial and dress them in white garment shroud, which is customary. And then, of course, if you're not connected to a synagogue that has its own Chevra Kadisha, if there is, again, for burial only, then we do arrange through one of the other Chevra Kadisha to perform the care of the body in that way. And then, families can choose, if you're not connected to a traditional rabbi, that the deceased is prepared by dressing them in their own clothes, which is performed by the funeral home. So, we arrange transport of the deceased at time of death, arrange for somebody to sit, how the deceased is prepared for burial, good communication for scheduling. We are responsible for completing and filing death certificate. And so it's just a process of gathering information about the person who died inputting it into the vital record system for Georgia, producing a proof, having the family review the proof to assure that everything is accurate and spelled correctly. We communicate with the physician who will sign the death certificate and placing cause of death. And then we file the death certificate with the county and obtain certified copies that the family needs for assets that are in their name. And of course, Jacky would know a lot about that. We are responsible or help the family to place obituaries in newspapers anywhere in the country. Although I think fewer people are doing them sometimes in newspapers because, as you know, many newspapers are fewer people are reading them. So a lot of times they're placed on our website as well. But we sort of hold the hand of the family and make that happen in a smooth way. And lastly, we are there to manage the funeral itself, whether it takes place at a synagogue or graveside or chapel, and just make sure that we're there to that things go smoothly and start on time, of course. So we send out of Atlanta to other cities quite a bit. And it just means that when we're contacted, we will communicate with the cemetery out of town and a funeral home out of town and make sure that the process goes smoothly. Within a certain radius, we will drive the deceased to their cemetery for burial, and sometimes in conjunction with another funeral home. Outside of a certain radius of Atlanta, the deceased is flown to their city, like in parts of Florida and mostly to the Northeast, but we send all over the country. And of course, if somebody passes away out of town, if the family wants us to be in charge, they would call us, and then we would engage a funeral home and then bring them to Atlanta. We send to, outside of the country, and we send to Israel about 5 or 6 times a year. And we have good experience on that process and how that works. And it does go, very smoothly. Locally, cemeteries in Atlanta, there are a few that have Jewish sections. We can bury at any cemetery, really. And there's just sort of a range of options for that. We do handle non-traditional, cremation and above ground burial based on what the family is requesting. And it's sort of, when it comes to cremation, there's sort of a range of what can happen, anywhere from, sometimes no funeral, but most people want to have some sort of a ceremony. So sometimes it's in our chapel or synagogue or another location. And, again, we're just there to make sure that everything goes smoothly. We handle funerals for veterans of armed forces, meaning if a veteran is honorably discharged, we can arrange for military honors with the VA. And then there is actually a VA cemetery in Canton, Georgia, and we bury there probably 10 or 15 times a year. And so we're very familiar with the process. And so a honorably discharged veteran and their spouse can be buried at any VA cemetery, actually in the country, that still has available space. So lastly, I'll just touch on planning. So, pre-planning a funeral, there's sort of 2 parts to it. It's really easy to do. I really think it's a responsible thing to, at the very least, inform your family of what you want. As Jacky said, many people don't do that. And, they find themselves sometimes in a situation where they're, somebody has passed away and their children just, if they're not connected, sometimes just don't know. And so it's really easy to do. It's responsible. And then the second part is people can prepay if they want to. And in Georgia and many states, when you prepay, the money is 100% escrowed. It goes into an account that's owned by the person setting it up, either for themselves or another person. And, the benefit primarily is just to have things in order. But you can fix some of the, a lot of the pricing when you do that, when you prepay with funeral home and or cemetery. It's, and I consider it a safe thing to do. And we do them quite a bit on a regular basis, and it's easy. It can be done on our website. It can be done via phone call and certainly in-person meeting. Just different people have different needs on how they do that these days. So that's sort of what I have to say in a nutshell. And I'm thinking that people might have questions, and I guess the rabbi is going to moderate that part. So thank you.
So we're going to open it up to questions now. Someone who wasn't able to be here tonight actually emailed me a question ahead of time, so we'll start with that so we don't forget. So the question that was sent by Alan Kovar, two parts. What is the Reformed Jewish view on cremation versus burial? Jacky touched on it a bit. And how does the conservative view differ from the Reformed view? She also touched on that. But ultimately, the Reform movement is the preference is burial. However, cremation is allowed. It's permitted. It happens. I wouldn't say often, but often enough. I've personally officiated a number of cremation funerals or celebrations of life or other memorial services where there was no actual body, where there was no coffin, where the body was cremated or was planning on being cremated shortly afterwards. He also asked, does CDT have a reserved section at the new cemetery in the Dunwoody area? I assume he means by that Eddie, Arlington?
No, that's north of
Oh, north of, so do we have one or?
okay,
So do the synagogues have reserved sections? So yeah, so our we do have a reserve section at Arlington. You can be buried anywhere though. You don't have to be buried in our section. And I've actually done funerals in the Sinai section for our members because that's where their plot happened to be at Arlington. So it's sort of a loose reserved section is how it seems to me to be. But there is one at Arlington. So are there any questions from anybody here in the room? The idea is returning to the earth. And even in the Reform movement where cremation is permitted and allowed, the idea still is returning to the earth in some way, whether that's burial or, scattering so that they, become part of nature again. As I mentioned, I've officiated a number of cremation, including a number where the cremains were buried, sometimes next to, sometimes even on top of, where the spouse was buried already, in a casket. Not typically, although a lot of it depends on location, a lot of it depends on custom of the area. In say New Orleans, where because of the topography, I think all of the burials are above ground, that it would be permitted. There are even, in ancient Israelite tradition, they have found caves where people are buried sort of in the niches of the caves. So there is, a tradition of that happening, but the sort of the general custom now is burial in the earth. Any other questions? Sharon. So often when that happens, and Eddie, you could probably speak to this too, often when that happens is earth from Israel will be placed in the coffin so that there's a connection to the earth. And often that'll happen anyways, is even when someone's buried in the earth from Israel will be added as part of the burial process, to have that, provide that connection back to what I was speaking of earlier with the idea of resurrection and returning to the land. that there's a connection to the land with burial. So the one funeral I've done where there was an above ground burial, that's what we did. Is there was earth from Israel placed in the coffin before the internment. You want to? Oh, come use the microphone, because people at home won't hear you.
Yeah, just simply earth from Israel and earth from Georgia are many times placed on top of the casket prior to placing into the crypt.
Then we can use
What-
Jersey soil.
Yeah, if you have your own earth, you certainly can provide it.
Any other questions? Yes, Alan. So if death is considered imminent and a person voluntarily stops eating and drinking, that's the question. Once we sort of reach that stages of imminent death in Jewish law, nothing's supposed to be done to hasten or put off death. It's supposed to happen on its own. However, if the person gets to a point where they're choosing to no longer eat or drink, it's not something that's forbidden under Jewish law because it's still considered part of that natural process of end of life, as far as I understand it. Leslie.
It's true. So unless it's a really, really extreme circumstance, person does not have to be embalmed for sending anywhere in the US. Sending out of the country, it is required with the exception of sending to Israel because they, have different standards for Jewish custom. So when somebody passes away, we bring them to our location. They're basically kept in a, cool room for that purpose temporarily until either burial or sending out to, another city. And then we can also put, cold packs in with them for transport. And so, I send out of Atlanta roughly 10 times a month to other cities. So, and I've been doing it for 20 years and thankfully everything goes, has gone very smoothly with it. Yes. Yes, we sent to Canada a few different times. Canada, I don't remember if embalming is required. I don't think so, but I would just need to, it's been a few years since sending to Canada. Yeah, I think Canada is considered similar to within the US.
Okay. I'm not here.
It's a more detailed answer.
Oh, hope, the 13 wishes, the 5 wishes. Okay. Okay. No, I'm not really familiar with that. I have to say. Okay, is it Pulse, P-U-L-S-C? Oh, P-O-L-S-T. Okay, actually, Pulse. I actually have heard of this document Now that I hear what you're saying, I'm sorry. POLST. A hospice, Alan Weinstein Hospice, which I think is the name of it, a Weinstein Hospice, actually did a little adult ed seminar at one point, and they talked about this type of document. It's kind of like the 5 wishes advanced healthcare directive document. Basically, what it is it's a very voluminous document that basically not only talks about the things that are in a standard advanced healthcare directive, but it also deals with personal choices. For example, in the event that you're dying, would you like to be read to? Personal preferences as far as music you'd like to listen to, etc. I actually, believe it or not, now that you're telling me this and it's refreshing back in my brain, I actually have a copy of this, I believe, in my records, and I can email you a copy of the document. But it's not anything that's legal. It's just a preferential document from what I understand. But I will get information and email it to you, absolutely. Because I remember that we discussed it when we went to a hospice seminar. Okay, you're welcome.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for coming tonight. I want to conclude first by thanking Jacky and thanking Eddie for their time this evening, for the wisdom that they bring and the experience they bring to this conversation that is so important. I do want to piggyback just very briefly off of something Jacky mentioned with her shameless plug earlier, and announce that in the coming weeks, we will be rolling out a program here at CDT that we're calling Pillars of CDT to encourage our members to think about the congregation when planning their estate and to put CDT into their estate planning. There's a document over on the table over there with some preliminary information and even a form to fill out if you either have already done so, thank you, or if you are planning to do so. And we'd like to encourage that and also to recognize those people who have included the synagogue in their plans for the future. It's a difficult conversation to have. It's something we don't like to talk about, we don't like to think about, but it's so important for all of the reasons that we've all discussed tonight, that this is something that, death is something that occurs for everyone. It's something we all come into contact with. It is at some point or another, we all walk through the valley of the shadow, as the Psalm says, and to have the conversations now with somebody like Eddie, with somebody like Jacky, with a spiritual advisor, with your spiritual leader like myself or someone else, to talk about what are your plans for the future are really a gift to your loved ones. It's really a gift to those who are part of your life so that they know what your wishes are, so that they can help you plan for the future, so that when death does occur and we are all dealing with the loss, dealing with the emotional burden, the emotional grief that comes with the loss, the practical side, the technical side, as I said before, doesn't weigh us down too much. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for those who joined us online. We hope to see you all soon. We have a lot of very exciting, important things coming up in the next few weeks. Just a few brief announcements of what is coming up. That next Friday night, October 29th, we have our spooky musical Shabbat, followed by a special sweet oneg and the opportunity to make your own golem. If you don't know what a golem is yet, you have to come to services. Also in the e-blast today, there was an explanation, but we'll have materials to make your own golem next Friday evening. No coincidence to any day that might be a couple days later. Just we thought October would be fun to have a spooky Shabbat. The following week, we will be honoring our veterans as a Veterans Day Shabbat. If you are a veteran, active duty, military, or Coast Guard, or the spouse or parents of military or Coast Guard active duty or veterans, we invite you to come to services. We invite everybody to come to support and honor those who have served, but those who have served and their families, we will invite to the Bima for a special blessing during that service on November 5th. And then on November 12th, we will have a special Shabbat of memory memorializing Kristallnacht, which falls during the middle of that week, the night of broken glass, and on which we will hear from our member, Art Meyer, Sherry Nemiroff's father, who is a survivor of the Holocaust, and he will tell us his story during that service. Then in December, just a preview, my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger, will be joining us for a Scholar in Residence weekend on December 17th and 18th. He'll be speaking here as part of our combined Shabbat service with Temple Beth Tikva in our sanctuary on Friday evening. And then on Saturday night, he will be speaking as part of a combined Havdalah at Temple Beth Tikva in their sanctuary. So thank you once again to our speakers tonight. Thank you all for coming. Have a nice evening, drive safe, and an early Shabbat Shalom.